I never expected to see my own blood on the kitchen floor. Not in my son's house, not at 71. It happened on a Tuesday. Snow had just started falling outside, soft and steady, like the hush before something breaks. Michael and his wife, Vanessa, had been tense all morning. I'd learned how to read the weather in that house, the subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure that warned of a coming storm. I made myself small, the way older women sometimes do when they sense their presence is no longer a comfort, but an inconvenience. Vanessa stood at the granite countertop, arms crossed over her chest, a posture of both defense and accusation. Her voice was sharper than usual, honed to a fine edge. "You're still holding on to the deed, aren't you, Eleanor?" She didn't need to raise her voice. Her tone sliced clean enough through the strained silence of the kitchen. I looked at her, then at my son. Michael didn't meet my eyes. He just stood there, fiddling with his phone, his thumb swiping endlessly over the glass screen as if this conversation didn't involve him at all. But it did. It involved all of us. The house, the one I had raised him in, the one his father and I had paid off 27 years ago, still had my name on it, and they didn't like that one bit. I knew they had been planning something for months. The signs were there, small and insidious, whispers that would stop the moment I entered a room, mail that went missing from the stack on the entryway table, drawers in the study that were suddenly locked. But I had kept quiet, telling myself I was imagining things, that grief was making me paranoid. I answered calmly, my voice even, a skill I'd perfected over decades of navigating hospital boardrooms. "I'm not ready to sign anything, Vanessa. Maybe we could all sit down later and talk it through properly. After dinner, perhaps." Vanessa didn't wait. She took 2 purposeful steps forward, her eyes cold. She pointed a manicured finger toward the glass-paned back door that led to the patio. "I think you need some fresh air, Eleanor," she said, her words dripping with false concern. "You're being emotional. It's better if you just step outside for a minute." Her hand gripped my upper arm, not hard at first, but with a firm, insistent pressure. It was a gesture meant to guide, but it felt like a command. Then something shifted in the room's energy. Michael, still silent, finally looked up from his phone and moved to stand beside her. I remember his hand brushing mine, a fleeting, almost gentle touch, as if he meant to help me walk. I remember the tightness in his jaw, a muscle twitching almost imperceptibly. The next second, I was falling. My back hit the glass. There was a loud, dry crack, a sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Then everything gave way in an explosion of cold and sharp edges. I landed outside, half in the freshly fallen snow, half in a glittering field of broken glass. The cold bit into my arms and legs instantly. The metallic smell of my own blood mixed with the bitter scent of pine and winter. For a long, terrifying moment, I thought I might never get up again. But I did. I always have. From inside, I heard Vanessa's voice, high and frantic. "It was an accident. She lost her balance. We were just trying to help her." But they didn't open the door. They didn't come to check on me. Not even Michael. I stood up, my body trembling, but my mind strangely clear. My hand was bleeding freely from a deep gash. My favorite wool coat was torn at the shoulder. Snow soaked through my shoes, chilling me to the bone. And yet, all I could feel was a profound stillness. Not shock, not pain, just a silent, ringing stillness. It was as if something inside me, something that had been bent and yielding for years, had finally snapped back into place. I turned away from the house and walked down the long, curving driveway without a single word. It wasn't the first time they had made me feel like I didn't belong, but it was the first time I saw it so clearly. They wanted me gone. They had plans for this house. And in their eyes, I was no longer the mother who had raised him, who had sacrificed for him. I was an obstacle, a signature on a piece of paper. a delay in their plans. I didn't go to the hospital. I went to the diner on 4th and Maple, a place that hadn't changed in 50 years. I slid into the back booth, the worn vinyl cool against my skin. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a kind face, didn't flinch when she saw the blood dripping from my hand. She just handed me a stack of clean napkins and a first aid kit from behind the counter. "Here, honey," she said quietly. "Take your time." And I did. That night, while the snow kept falling, I booked a rental car online and checked into a nondescript motel on the edge of town. My hand ached, a dull, throbbing pain, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I knew I had to act carefully, quietly. I wasn't going to scream or beg or play the victim. I was going to do what I had always done best: observe, think, and move with precision. They thought I was weak. They thought I was finished, a retired old woman with a modest pension and nothing left to give. But they forgot who built this life in the first place. They forgot who made sure they never went hungry, who covered their college loans without a second thought, who co-signed their first mortgage when no bank would take a chance on them. They forgot, but I didn't. If you're still listening, thank you for being here. Some stories don't start with a smile or a celebration. Some start with the sound of broken glass and the silence that follows. But silence, when chosen, can be powerful, and mine was just beginning. I stayed at that motel for 3 nights. It was the kind of place where the sheets were always cold, no matter the season, and the ceiling fan made a soft, ticking sound like an old clock running out of time. But it was anonymous and quiet, and no one asked questions. I needed quiet more than I needed comfort. The morning after the incident, I rose before the sun. My hand had swollen, a painful, puffy reminder of the fall, but I cleaned the wound again with supplies from the motel's sparse first aid kit and wrapped it tightly. The physical pain was a grounding force, a clear and present reality that cut through the fog of betrayal. I sat at the small, wobbly desk with a cup of weak coffee and a complimentary notepad. I made myself a list. Just 4 things, simple, measurable, things I could control. At the top of the list, I wrote one word: proof. I had always trusted my instincts. I'd spent 30 years as a hospital network executive, reading people in boardrooms and mediation rooms, diffusing conflict with nothing more than a calm voice and the right choice of words. But this wasn't a professional negotiation. This was my life, my son, my home. The lines had blurred slowly over time, the colors of love and obligation bleeding into one another until I couldn't tell if I was living with family or among people waiting for me to leave. I remembered something from a few months earlier, a quiet afternoon when Vanessa had taken the kids to her mother's and I had the house to myself. A persistent, nagging unease had prompted me to do something I never thought I'd do. I had installed a small security camera. Nothing fancy, just a simple device connected to a private cloud server. It was tucked into the corner of the living room bookshelf, disguised as a little ceramic owl, a kitschy thing I'd picked up at a flea market. I told no one. I never thought I'd actually need it, but after that moment at the door, I knew. I called the friend who had helped me set it up, Grace, an old colleague from my hospital days. She now worked in compliance and tech security, was sharp as a tack, and never asked unnecessary questions. Within 2 hours, she had recovered the footage from the cloud and sent a secure link to my private drive. I watched it once, and only once, on my laptop in the dim light of the motel room. There it was, in grainy color. Vanessa's sharp words, Michael's passive stance, the angle of their bodies as they moved toward me. The footage captured the moment his hand brushed mine and her grip tightened on my arm. It captured the unmistakable, coordinated forward motion, the sound of my body hitting the glass, the sickening sharpness of the break, and then, the most damning part of all, the silence that followed. They stood there, looking out through the shattered frame, before Michael calmly closed the interior wooden door, leaving me outside. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just hurt feelings. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was assault, and they had covered it with a thin veil of false concern. All while eyeing the house I had paid off with my late husband, a home they saw not as a legacy, but as an asset to be liquidated. The next day, I called a lawyer. Her name was Isabel Thorne, a woman in her 50s with a voice that sounded like gravel and steel. She didn't ask for drama. She asked for documentation. I gave her everything. While she began drafting a formidable case for elder abuse, property coercion, and assault, I started putting the rest of my plans into motion. I visited a branch of my bank in a neighboring town, a place where no one knew my face. I withdrew enough cash to move things quickly, but not so much that it would raise any flags. Most of my funds remained untouched, a quiet fortune they knew nothing about, still tied up in municipal bonds, a private real estate trust, and a separate account linked to a trust fund left to me by an old, grateful client I had helped navigate a complex medical crisis years ago. $21 million in total. It had taken a lifetime of careful work, savvy investments, and the trust of others to build, but it was mine. I had never spoken about it to Michael. He and Vanessa assumed my retirement came from a modest pension, that I lived on Social Security and the leftovers from his father's life insurance. That assumption had kept them comfortable in their sense of superiority, in their entitlement. And Vanessa, she never imagined I might be more than what I appeared to be, a woman with gray hair, soft sweaters, and quiet mornings. It was a disguise of sorts, one I hadn't even realized I was wearing until it became a weapon they tried to use against me. I rented a short-term furnished apartment in Denver under a different name, a month-to-month lease with no frills, no noise. I didn't need a view. I needed a secure space to think, a headquarters. The first thing I placed on the clean kitchen counter was a simple black folder. Inside it was the link to the footage, a printed copy of the house deed, my living will, and Isabel's first draft of the legal complaint. Then I sat down in a generic armchair, breathed in the scent of fresh paint and new carpets, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel everything. The profound betrayal, the stinging humiliation, the deep, hollow ache of being seen as disposable by the very person I had given everything to. But beneath that ache, something else had started to bloom. A quiet, unyielding resolve, not to punish, not to destroy, but to reclaim. Not just my name on a piece of paper, not just my house, but my space, my dignity, my place in the world. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, this was only the beginning. I woke that morning before the sun rose, not out of restlessness, but with a stark clarity. There was a strange comfort in the anonymity of my new apartment. The hum of the heater, the faint whoosh of traffic from a nearby road, the hollow sound of my slippers on the kitchen floor. It was the soundtrack of a life untethered, and for now, that was exactly what I needed. I boiled water for tea and stood in front of the folder I had placed on the counter. It was a plain black folder, but what it held had the weight of a life's turning point. Inside were the 3 documents that would define my next chapter. The first was the printed copy of the house deed. My name, Eleanor Vance, was still there, clear as daylight. No joint ownership, no transfer signatures. I had held off signing anything for years, always feeling a small, persistent pull in my gut that said, wait. That intuition had saved me. The second was a detailed ledger of my financial holdings, compiled not for pride, but for facts. Most of the money had come in over decades, the result of quiet, strategic investments in long-term care housing, innovative hospital systems, and wellness centers across 3 states. Former clients and mentors, people whose lives and fortunes I had helped protect, had left pieces to me in their wills and trusts out of gratitude. I never spent much. I never needed to. I had enough. The third was the link to the security footage with a still frame printed on the cover page. My face, my hands in the air, the blur of motion, the moment before the fall. I closed the folder gently. Today, I would begin filing the formal paperwork with Isabel. But before that, I needed to look backward one last time to connect the dots I had previously refused to see. I pulled out an old notebook from my purse, the kind with a green cloth cover, its edges worn soft from years of use. I had used it to jot down things that felt off, conversations and events that were too small to protest, but too strange to ignore. Reading it now, the small moments didn't just form a pattern, they revealed a strategy. July 12th, mail sorted before it reached the kitchen table. My bank statement was missing. September 3rd, Michael insisted on managing the utility bills himself, claiming he could get a better rate. I later found out he'd tried to list himself as a secondary account holder. October 19th, Vanessa's questions, casual but calculated, about who would inherit the house and whether I had updated my will since Dad passed. November 5th, my Social Security statement never arrived. The envelope from my investment firm was also gone. I remembered the day I asked if my new Medicare card had arrived. Vanessa had waved me off, saying she'd put it somewhere safe for me. I never saw it. Alone in the kitchen of that quiet apartment, I realized what I had been feeling for so long wasn't paranoia. It was the slow, creeping recognition of a plan. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were preparing for me to disappear, quietly, without fuss, without questions. I took a long sip of tea and stared out the window. The snow had returned, fine and steady, covering the rooftops of Denver like a layer of dust on forgotten shelves. After breakfast, I dressed with care, not out of vanity, but out of purpose. Gray trousers, a black turtleneck sweater, and a wool coat, the same coat I wore when I signed my first leadership contract at the hospital in 1984. That coat had seen the inside of more boardrooms than most junior partners ever would. It was my armor. I carried the folder into Isabel Thorne's office at exactly 10 o'clock a.m. Her assistant led me into a room with bookshelves lined in legal binders and framed citations. Isabel sat behind a clean desk. No clutter, no photos, only a pen and a yellow legal pad. She didn't offer small talk. She opened the folder, flipped through each page, her expression unreadable, and nodded. It took less than 30 minutes for her to confirm what I already knew. I had a case, a strong one, not just for assault, but for a clear pattern of financial manipulation, coercion, and willful neglect of a dependent elder. Colorado had strict laws on elder abuse, and Isabel had a reputation for handling such cases quietly, without media attention, but with unyielding firmness. I asked her to keep everything sealed for as long as possible. I wasn't looking for headlines. I wanted resolution. She agreed. We would move slowly, but deliberately. By noon, I had signed the preliminary affidavit. By 3 o'clock p.m., copies of the footage had been secured in 2 separate, encrypted locations. By sundown, I was back at the apartment sitting in the same chair by the window. The folder was now thinner, its contents officially in the hands of the law, but its impact felt heavier than ever. It would still be weeks, maybe months before charges were formally filed, but the motion had begun. And once something like this starts rolling, it cannot be undone. That night, I didn't sleep much. My body ached in places it didn't before. My hand still had a slight tremor, but I no longer felt small or forgotten or invisible. I knew the son I raised didn't see me clearly anymore. He saw what he thought I represented, an obstacle, a liability, a delay. But he didn't know everything. He didn't know the funds had already been moved into a separate holding company. He didn't know the trust had been updated, removing all heirs until further notice. He didn't know the title of the house was not only still in my name but was now legally shielded by a revocable trust, and most of all, He didn't know that the woman they tried to erase had already written the next chapter without them. It would be weeks before they noticed anything was missing. But the silence I left behind would grow louder with every passing day. 3 days after I left Isabel's office, I received a quiet call just after 8:00 a.m. Her voice was even, calm. "It's done, Eleanor. The paperwork is filed. The complaint is officially entered into the court system." She told me not to expect anything dramatic at first. "These things take time," she said, "but it has begun." I didn't speak much, just a soft thank you. Then I hung up and stood in the middle of my small kitchen, letting the silence speak. That same afternoon, I drove to a private postal center. I handed over a pre-sealed envelope. Inside were 3 printed items: a copy of the complaint, a formal letter from Isabel requesting the immediate return of any and all house-related documents, and a notice of restricted contact, effective immediately. The address on the envelope was Michael and Vanessa's. I didn't linger. By the time I returned to my apartment, snow had started falling again, this time heavier, pressing everything down, making the world quieter. I sat by the window and opened my green notebook. Flipping back through the older entries, I saw the pattern so clearly now. It was all subtle, all calculated. I made a new list that day. Not of what I had lost, but what I still had full control over. The deed, the trust, the footage, the law, and most important of all, myself. The following morning, Isabel emailed an update. The court had issued a preliminary review date. If things continued as expected, the footage would be used as direct evidence, and a temporary restraining order could be placed against both Michael and Vanessa. I didn't celebrate, but I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, but alignment. That week, I also met with Marcus, the estate planner. I told him to prepare documents that would move the bulk of my holdings into a new foundation, a nonprofit trust dedicated to supporting career retraining and wellness resources for women over 60, especially those who had given everything to family, only to find themselves discarded. Marcus didn't blink. He asked smart questions and gave me timelines. I left his office with a binder of drafts and a calendar full of quiet, decisive steps. A few days later, I received a voicemail. It was Vanessa. Her voice was tight, professional. She said they had received my lawyer's letter and were surprised at the accusations. She hoped we could resolve this privately. No apology, no regret, just damage control. She sounded more worried about the paper trail than the glass shards that had been buried in my skin. I didn't respond. Isabel would handle all contact. Instead, I prepared. I made copies of all documents and stored them in 3 separate locations. I purchased a new jacket, gray wool, heavy, built for cold days. The old one, the one with the faint bloodstain on the sleeve, I folded and placed in a sealed evidence bag. Not to forget, but to preserve the line between before and after. Then I went for a walk. The wind was sharp, but I didn't flinch. My body had adjusted to discomfort, but my mind was clearer than ever. They thought pushing me through glass would break me. What they didn't realize was that some glass breaks clean, but the woman standing on the other side can come out sharper. Not bitter, just precise. And now I had precision, paperwork, patience, and the law on my side. The apartment grew quieter as the week went on. Each morning I woke with the same rhythm: tea, documents, walking. On the 5th morning, I drove west into the mountains toward Aspen. I didn't tell anyone. The road twisted through tall pines and frozen lakes. The air felt cleaner than anything I had breathed in weeks. I checked into a small, clean cabin. I wasn't there for leisure. I was there to breathe in silence, to remember who I was before the noise began. That evening, I soaked in the outdoor hot springs. The next morning, I sat on the wooden deck, wrapped in a blanket, sipping coffee, and thought about the version of myself who used to make excuses for Michael's behavior. Maybe he's just stressed. Maybe I misunderstood. I had stopped making excuses the day my back hit the glass. I spent the day walking through town, anonymous. I bought books about women who changed their lives late in life. By the third day, the cabin felt like it belonged to me, not because I owned it, but because I had brought myself there by choice. I wrote letters that night, not to them, but to myself. To the version of me at 40 who spent birthdays alone because they forgot. To the version at 60 who had quietly paid their credit card debt. I forgave those women. I thanked them. Without their quiet endurance, I wouldn't be here now, strong enough to walk away, smart enough to plan ahead. That night, the snow turned violent, winds howling against the windows. But the fireplace stayed lit, and the roof held strong. I didn't feel unsafe. I felt awake. The next morning, I drove back to Denver, but I wasn't going back to the apartment. I drove straight to a modest office building that housed my newly registered foundation. The paperwork had been finalized 2 days before. I walked up to the receptionist and smiled when she looked up and said the name aloud. The Montrose Initiative, a place for women over 60 to rebuild, quietly, powerfully, on their own terms. She handed me the welcome packet. I walked into the small office reserved for me and sat down behind the desk. No ceremony, no applause, but inside, I felt something real. Michael once told me I was too sensitive. Now, I took things personally on purpose. Because sometimes after the snow settles, you realize the path wasn't lost. It was just covered for a while. And now, I was walking it on my own. The first time I saw Vanessa again, it wasn't in a courtroom. It was at a luxury property showcase. The real estate firm she worked for was hosting a tour of a newly renovated home on the outskirts of Denver. What Vanessa didn't know was that the private investment group that funded the project had recently come under new management. Quietly, discreetly, that management was me. I arrived early, wearing dark sunglasses and a long coat. I walked the house like any other guest, listening to Vanessa's polished voice explain the imported tile and underfloor heating. When she turned and caught sight of me, her professional smile flickered for a fraction of a second. I didn't give her the chance to regroup. I walked into the master bedroom, her young assistant following me. The assistant informed me, with a tone more arrogant than necessary, that this was a private showing. I turned slowly and handed her a business card. It had the name of the investment firm. My name was listed as strategic partner. Her eyes widened. She stammered something about checking with Vanessa. I told her to take her time. 10 minutes later, Vanessa came into the sunroom where I was waiting. She didn't greet me. I saw the panic beneath her calm. "Everything has a paper trail, Vanessa," I said simply. "All things left behind eventually lead back home." And then I left. I didn't need a confrontation. The point was to remind her she had underestimated the wrong woman. That night, Isabel forwarded new correspondence from the court. The investigation had officially moved from preliminary review to active motion. There would be depositions and hearings. That same week, the bank confirmed the first transfer of $5 million had settled into the Montrose Initiative's accounts. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The ground beneath their feet had begun to shift, and I was no longer standing still. The silence from my son was telling. Vanessa, however, couldn't help herself. A week after the showcase, her legal team sent a carefully worded email suggesting a resolution outside of court. They wanted a deal. Isabel's reply was brief: "The process will continue." Later that day, Marcus called. A third-party group was trying to poke holes in my trust, asking for ownership verification on a parcel of land. He had already handled it. The documents were ironclad. This was desperation disguised as strategy. The court then issued a formal notice. A promotion hearing was scheduled in 2 weeks. The evidence, including the footage, would be released to both sides. The video would no longer be a quiet file on a private drive. It would become a matter of record. I spent that afternoon walking through the local arboretum. I thought about the last Christmas I had spent in that house, feeling like a ghost at my own family's table. I had been so determined to keep the peace. Now I knew that true peace wasn't the absence of conflict, it was the presence of justice. Meanwhile, I kept moving. I met with the Foundation's first round of advisors, women from different parts of the state who had been overlooked and undervalued. As I listened to them share their ideas, I realized that for all the silence I had endured, I had never truly lost my voice. I had just been speaking to the wrong people. After the meeting, one of the women, Janice, told me she had seen the way I listened, not just to reply, but to hold space for someone else's truth. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in years. That night, I placed my evidence folder in a new fireproof safe. It was no longer just protection, it was preparation. Stillness, I had learned, is not weakness. It is waiting with intention, and I was done waiting. The hearing wasn't loud. There were no flashing cameras, just a small, cold courtroom on the second floor. I arrived early, dressed in navy slacks and my late husband's watch. It wasn't for comfort. It was to remind me of the years I held everything together. Today was about ownership. Isabel was already there, her calm presence steadying the air. Across the aisle, Michael sat stiffly, his suit ill-fitting. His eyes flickered toward me, then dropped. Vanessa entered a few minutes later, dressed in black, and sat in the row behind him, alone. The judge, a woman with steel-gray hair, called the room to order. The clerk read the charges: misdemeanor elder abuse, obstruction of reporting, attempted coercion of property, 3 charges that echoed in the space between us. Then, Isabel presented the footage on a large monitor. No sound, just the video, my body staggering back, the glass shattering. I disappeared from view. The video ended. The courtroom was utterly still. Even the judge sat motionless for several seconds before making a note. Michael's attorney responded with deflections: stress, miscommunication, an argument taken out of context. He painted a picture of a son pushed too far. Vanessa was asked to make a statement. She shook her head. No words. Her silence was the loudest thing she had ever said. The judge didn't deliberate long. She ruled that the case would proceed to full review, that the evidence warranted further action, and that the protective order I requested would be extended. Michael and Vanessa were ordered not to contact me, their shared financial accounts frozen and under audit. When the gavel came down, I stood, nodded to Isabel, and walked out of the room without looking back. At a nearby cafe, I ordered a black coffee, opened my notebook, and drew a line through the day's date. Then I turned the page and wrote one sentence: I am not broken. When I returned to my apartment, a handwritten letter was waiting. It was from Michael. He said he was sorry, that he'd been under pressure, that he didn't expect it to go this far. He asked me to remember the boy he used to be. I read it once, then placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Forgiveness is a process, not a performance. That night, I sat by the window in the dark. The house they tried to take was now fully restored to my name. My foundation had gained its nonprofit status. There were lives I would help change, not out of revenge, but because I could. And that was power, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that builds. The lake behind my apartment froze in early January. I had watched it slowly still over weeks. That morning, I walked the trail around it, the air cold but clean. I had just left the last board meeting for the quarter. Over 200 women had come through the Foundation's programs that fall. One of them, Donna, a woman in her 70s, had started her own bookkeeping service. I thought life was done with me, she had cried in my office. Turns out I just needed a second wind. My phone buzzed. It was a message from my granddaughter, a photo of a sketch she had drawn, a woman sitting at a window, looking at the snow. Underneath, she wrote, I remember you like this, Grandma. My heart was full, not with grief, but with something softer. Forgiveness, maybe. Not for them, but for myself. For all the years I thought my value depended on how much I endured without complaint. That weekend, I drove up to a cabin near Aspen, a place I'd purchased quietly, a place that was entirely mine. Before I left, I looked in the mirror. The lines were still there, the gray still threaded through my hair, but the eyes were different, not hardened, just clear. I whispered something only for myself to hear. You kept going. And I had. Through the doubt, the betrayal, the silence, I had been enough all along. I just needed to remember how to stand on my own ground. And now I had. If you've ever been dismissed or forgotten, this story was meant for you. Share how you feel after hearing this journey. You never know, your words might be the light someone else needs. This isn't just a storytelling channel. This is where silence gets heard.